Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is in honor of Ukraine's Independence Day and why we should know about it. Today, on the 24th of August, 2023, we commemorate the 32nd Independence Day of Ukraine. So how did Ukraine get its independence in 1991? Well, we start in the year 1985. The last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, came into power in 1985. And the following year, on April 26, 1986, the tragedy on the Chernobyl nuclear power station in Ukraine happened. Gorbachev and his government alienated Ukrainians, since the Chernobyl power plant was operated and managed from Moscow. This meant that Ukrainians had no influence over what happened on their territory. They had no knowledge of how the explosion happened, yet they needed to be the ones trying to clean up the mess, evacuate people, and keep them safe. The Moscow regime wanted to keep the disaster hidden from the international community. The May 1st parade, which was an annual parade on the Day of International Solidarity of Workers, it's similar to today's Labor Day, was ordered by Gorbachev to take place regardless of the disaster, which just happened a few days before. This turned Ukrainians even further against Gorbachev. As Serhiy Plokhy wrote in his book, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, and I quote, "As things turned out, the two conflicting groups in Ukraine, the communist establishment and the National Democratic opposition, would discover a common interest in opposing Moscow in general and Gorbachev in particular." End of quote. Gorbachev instituted the policies of perestroika, restructuring in English, and glasnost. Perestroika took away the decision-making power from ministries in Moscow and put them in the individual enterprises. Meanwhile, glasnost meant openness, which meant that people from below who were not in power could now criticize those in power and make suggestions. These changes allowed new organizations to be created. For example, in 1988, the first openly political organization was created in the Perestroika-era Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian Helsinki Union, which monitored the human rights violations in the Soviet Union under the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975. Meanwhile, the first mass organization, with 150,000 members at the end of its first year, was Society for the Protection of Ukrainian Language. In the late 1980s, Ukraine started recovering from the Soviet propaganda and historiography. They started mass printing the history works of Mikhail Khrushchevsky and the works of the executed Renaissance from the 1920s and 30s. These were the Ukrainian poets, writers, and artists, etc., who wrote in Ukrainian things that were unpleasant to the Stalinist regime. Around 260 Ukrainian writers were imprisoned and/or shot, both of which led to imminent death. The stories from the covered-up Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide, also came through. It was a famine created on purpose by Stalin and Ukraine, and it led to around 3.9 to 7 million deaths. All Mikhail Khrushchevsky, the executed Renaissance, and the Holodomor deserve their own episodes. Needless to say that these memories and discoveries of hidden truths did not warm Ukrainians up towards Moscow, Russia, and the Soviet Union in general. Cossack history also made its way back into mainstream culture. The Cossacks united East and West Ukraine, as well as North and South. They reminded Ukrainians of their culture, their independence, and their nation. As Serhiy Plokhy noted, Cossack history at the time was closely linked to the national idea that were further developed with time. In 1990, there was a march to the east where tens of thousands of people joined the march to the important Cossack sites in eastern Ukraine to awaken the feelings of Ukrainian nationality, and the march was a huge success. In 1989, the Ukrainian Catholic Church was legalized. In 1990, a new Ukrainian parliament was elected, which changed the entire political scene, and later that same year, Ukraine declared itself as a sovereign country. In his book, Serhiy Plokhy clarifies that, quote, "The declaration did not stipulate the republic's secession from the USSR, but gave its laws precedence over those of the Union, which meant that Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union and not an independent country." Gorbachev's reforms, which I talked about before, were unable to make the Soviet Union more stable. Instead, they made it start falling apart completely. By the end of the 1990s, Leonid Kravchuk was arguably the most popular leader in Ukraine, and he will later become the first president of Ukraine. When, in the autumn of 1990, Gorbachev rolled back his approval for democratic freedoms, students from all over Ukraine came to the main square in Kiev. Then it was called the October Revolution Square, now it's called Independence Square, known as Maidan, and they were striking and demanding Ukraine leaving the negotiations for the new Union Treaty. More than 50,000 Kievians protected the students from the police, and soon all of Kyiv universities went on strike as well. The strike was successful, and the pro-Soviet head of government was dismissed. On August 1st, 1999, less than a month before the Declaration of Independence, American President George Bush came to Kyiv in order to convince Ukraine to stay in the USSR. Many Ukrainians wanted a completely independent state, but the majority wanted at least a broad autonomy within a reformed union. Ukraine was not ready to sign any agreements still, so Bush pushed on. He gave the famous Chicken Kyiv speech, and it gets its name from the dish called Chicken Kyiv, which is incredibly delicious. And now I will quote a part of his speech. "Yet freedom is not the same as independence. Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred. We will support those who want to build democracy. By democracy, we mean a system of government in which people may weigh openly upon the hearts and yes, the votes of the public. We mean a system of government that derives its just power from the consent of the governed, that retains its legitimacy by controlling its appetite for power. For years you had elections with ballots, but you did not enjoy democracy, and now democracy has begun to set firm roots in Soviet soil." End of quote. Bush goes on to mention that he looks forward to working with the Soviet Union and Ukraine as part of the Union. Nonetheless, a coup against Gorbachev was already in the works. Starting in Crimea and ending in Moscow, it failed, but weakened Gorbachev. Soon after, Gorbachev was forced to resign, and the leader of the Russian Socialist Soviet Republic took over the Soviet Union. His name was Yeltsin. In connection with that, on August 24th, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament voted on the independence of Ukraine. The draft of the Declaration of Independence was read out. It said, "In view of the mortal danger hanging over Ukraine in connection with the coup d'état on 19th of August 1991, and continuing the 1,000-year tradition of state-building in Ukraine, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic solemnly declares the independence of Ukraine." End of quote. The results of the vote were overwhelming. 346 voted in favor, 5 abstained, and only 2 were against. Once the results of the vote appeared on screen outside, the crowd erupted into applause. A referendum on December 1st, 1991 would confirm the vote, and with the turnout of 84% of the population, more than 90% of the voters have voted for independence. Ukraine was now officially independent. Overall, it was not as spontaneous or easy getting independence as it might have seemed at first. Ukraine was independent multiple times before and tried to get independence multiple times when it was not. Of course, the independence achieved in 1991 was worked for and fought for and planned for, even under the pressure of the USSR and the US, and of course, internal communist opposition, which was there for a while. Yet overall, it was an amazing feat, and I can say with certainty, not suicidal nationalism. Happy 32nd Ukraine, even though you've existed for way longer than that. Thank you so much for joining me today, and this was what we need to know about Ukraine on Independence Day.